bold to imagine presence. The Last Hieroglyph by Clark Ashton Smith. Read by Robert Wayne.
The world itself, in the end, shall be turned to a round cipher. Old Prophecy of Zothique. Nushain, the astrologer, had studied the circling orbs of night from many far-separated regions, and had cast, with such skill as he was able to command, the horoscopes of a myriad of men, women, and children. From city to city, from realm to realm he had gone, abiding briefly in any place, for often the local magistrates had banished him as a common charlatan, or elsewise, in due time, his consultants had discovered the error of his predictions and had fallen away from him. Sometimes he went hungry and shabby, and small honor was paid to him anywhere. The sole companions of his precarious fortunes were a wretched mongrel dog that had somehow attached itself to him in the desert town of Zolbasire, and a mute, one-eyed black man whom he had bought very cheaply on Euros. He had named the dog Ansarath, after the canine star, and had called the black Mouzda, which was a word signifying darkness. In the course of his prolonged itinerations, the astrologer came to Zothique and made his abode in its capital, Ummaos, which had been built above the shards of an elder city of the same name, long since destroyed by a sorcerer's wrath. Here Nushain lodged with Ansarath and Mouzda in a half-ruinous attic of a rotting tenement, and from the tenement's roof, Nushain was wont to observe the positions and movements of the sidereal bodies on evenings not obscured by the fumes of the city. At intervals, some housewife or jade, some porter or huckster or petty merchant, would climb the decaying stairs to his chamber and would pay him a small sum for the nativity which he plotted with immense care by the aid of his tattered books of astrological science. When, as often occurred, he found himself still at a loss regarding the significance of some heavenly conjunction or opposition after poring over his books, he would consult Ansarath, and would draw profound auguries from the variable motions of the dog's mangy tail or his actions in searching for fleas. Certain of these divinations were fulfilled to the considerable benefit of Nushain's renown in Ummaos. People came to him more freely and frequently, hearing that he was a soothsayer of some note, and moreover he was immune from prosecution, owing to the liberal laws of Zothique, which permitted all the sorcerous and mantic arts. It seemed, for the first time, that the dark planets of his fate were yielding to auspicious stars. For this fortune, and the coins which accrued thereby to his purse, he gave thanks to Vergama, who, throughout the whole continent of Zothique, was deemed the most powerful and mysterious of the genii, and was thought to rule over the heavens as well as the earth. On a summer night, when the stars were strewn thickly like a fiery sand on the black azure vault, Nushain went up to the roof of his lodging place. As was often his custom, he took with him the black Mouzda, whose one eye possessed a miraculous sharpness and had served well, on many occasions, to supplement the astrologer's own rather near-sighted vision. Through a well-codified system of signs and gestures, the mute was able to communicate the result of his observations to Nushain. On this night, the constellation of the Great Dog, which had presided over Nushain's birth, was ascendant in the east. Regarding it closely, the dim eyes of the astrologer were troubled by a sense of something unfamiliar in its configuration. He could not determine the precise character of the change, till Mouzda, who evinced much excitement, called his attention to 3 new stars of the second magnitude which had appeared in close proximity to the dog's hindquarters. These remarkable novae, which Nushain could discern only as 3 reddish blurs, formed a small equilateral triangle. Nushain and Mouzda were both certain that they had not been visible on any previous evening. "By Vergama, this is a strange thing," swore the astrologer, filled with amazement and dumbfoundment. He began to compute the problematic influence of the novae on his future reading of the heavens, and perceived at once that they would exert, according to the law of astral emanations, a modifying effect on his own destiny, which had been so largely controlled by the dog. He could not, however, without consulting his books and tables, decide the particular trend and import of this supervening influence, though he felt sure that it was most momentous, whether for his bale or welfare. Leaving Mouzda to watch the heavens for other prodigies, he descended at once to his attic. There, after collating the opinions of several old-time astrologers on the power exerted by novae, he began to recast his own horoscope. Painfully and with much agitation he labored throughout the night, and did not finish his figurings till the dawn came to mix a deathly grayness with the yellow light of the candles. There was, it seemed, but one possible interpretation of the altered heavens. The appearance of the triangle of novae in conjunction with the dog signified clearly that Nushain was to start ere long on an unpremeditated journey which would involve the transit of no less than 3 elements. Mouzda and Ansarath were to accompany him, and 3 guides, appearing successively at the proper times, would lead him toward a destined goal. So much his calculations had revealed, but no more. There was nothing to foretell whether the journey would prove auspicious or disastrous, nothing to indicate its bourne, purpose, or direction. The astrologer was much disturbed by this somewhat singular and equivocal augury. He was ill-pleased by the prospect of an imminent journey, for he did not wish to leave Ummaos, among whose credulous people he had begun to establish himself, not without success. Moreover, a strong apprehension was roused within him by the oddly manifold nature and veiled outcome of the journey. All this, he felt, was suggestive of the workings of some occult and perhaps sinister providence. And surely it was no common traveling which would take him through 3 elements and would require a triple guidance. During the nights that followed, he and Mouzda watched the mysterious novae as they went over toward the west behind the bright flaming dog, and he puzzled interminably over his charts and volumes, hoping to discover some error in the reading he had made. But always, in the end, he was compelled to the same interpretation. More and more, as time went on, he was troubled by the thought of that unwelcome and mysterious journey which he must make. He continued to prosper in Ummaos, and it seemed that there was no conceivable reason for his departure from that city. He was as one who awaited a dark and secret summons, not knowing whence it would come, nor at what hour. Throughout the days, he scanned with fearful anxiety the faces of his visitors, deeming that the first of the 3 star-predicted guides might arrive unheralded and unrecognized among them. Mouzda and the dog Ansarath, with the intuition of dumb things, were sensible of the weird uneasiness felt by their master. They shared it palpably, the black man showing his apprehension by wild and demoniac grimaces, and the dog crouching under the astrologer's table, or prowling restlessly to and fro with his half-hairless tail between his legs. Such behavior, in its turn, served to reconfirm the inquietude of Nushain, who deemed it a bad omen. On a certain evening, Nushain pored for the 50th time over his horoscope, which he had drawn with sundry colored inks on a sheet of papyrus. He was much startled when, on the blank lower margin of the sheet, he saw a curious character which was no part of his own scribbling. The character was a hieroglyph written in dark bituminous brown, and seeming to represent a mummy, whose shroudings were loosened about the legs and whose feet were set in the posture of a long stride. It was facing toward that quarter of the chart where stood the sign indicating the great dog, which in Zothique was a house of the zodiac. Nushain's surprise turned to a sort of trepidation as he studied the hieroglyph. He knew that the margin of the chart had been wholly clear on the previous night, and during the past day he had not left the attic at any time. Mouzda, he felt sure, would never have dared to touch the chart, and moreover, the black man was little skilled in writing. Among the various inks employed by Nushain, there was none that resembled the sullen brown of the character, which seemed to stand out in a sad relief on the white papyrus. Nushain felt the alarm of one who confronts a sinister and unexplainable apparition. No human hand, surely, had inscribed the mummy-shapen character, like the sign of a strange outer planet about to invade the houses of his horoscope. Here, as in the advent of the three novae, an occult agency was suggested. Vainly, for many hours, he sought to unriddle the mystery, but in all his books there was naught to enlighten him, for this thing, it seemed, was wholly without precedent in astrology. During the next day he was busied from morn till eve with the plotting of those destinies ordained by the heavens for certain people of Ummaos. After completing the calculations with his usual toilsome care, he unrolled his own chart once more, albeit with trembling fingers. An eeriness that was nigh to panic seized him when he saw that the brown hieroglyph no longer stood on the margin, but was now placed like a striding figure in one of the lower houses, where it still fronted toward the dog, as if advancing on that ascendant sign. Henceforth, the astrologer was fevered with the awe and curiosity of one who watches a fatal but inscrutable portent. Never, during the hours that he pondered above it, was there any change in the intruding character, and yet, on each successive evening, when he took out the chart, he saw that the mummy had strode upward into a higher house, drawing always nearer to the house of the dog. There came a time when the figure stood on the dog's threshold. Portentous with mystery and menace that were still beyond the astrologer's divining, it seemed to wait while the night wore on, and was shot through with the gray wefting of dawn. Then, overworn with his prolonged studies and vigils, Nushain slept in his chair. Without the troubling of any dream, he slept, and Mouzda was careful not to disturb him, and no visitors came to the attic on that day. So the morn and the noon and the afternoon went over, and their going was unheeded by Nushain. He was awakened at eve by the loud and dolorous howling of Ansarath, which appeared to issue from the room's farthest corner. Confusedly, ere he opened his eyes, he became aware of an odor of bitter spices and piercing natron. Then, with the dim webs of sleep not wholly swept from his vision, he beheld, by the yellowy tapers that Mouzda had lighted, a tall, mummy-like form that waited in silence beside him. The head, arms, and body of the shape were wound closely with bitumen-colored cerements, but the folds were loosened from the hips downward, and the figure stood like a walker, with one brown, withered foot in advance of its fellow. Terror quickened in Nushain's heart, and it came to him that the shrouded shape, whether lich or phantom, resembled the weird, invasive hieroglyph that had passed from house to house through the chart of his destiny. Then, from the thick swathings of the apparition, a voice issued indistinctly, saying, "Prepare yourself, O Nushain, for I am the first guide of that journey, which was foretold to you by the stars." Ansarath, cowering beneath the astrologer's bed, was still howling his fear of the visitant, and Nushain saw that Mouzda had tried to conceal himself in company with the dog. Though a chill as of imminent death was upon him, and he deemed the apparition to be death itself, Nushain arose from the chair with that dignity proper to an astrologer, which he had maintained through all the vicissitudes of his lifetime. He called Mouzda and Ansarath from their hiding place, and the two obeyed him, though with many cringings before the dark, muffled mummy. With the comrades of his fortune behind him, Nushain turned to the visitant. "I am ready," he said, in a voice whose quavering was almost imperceptible, "but I would like with me certain of my belongings." The mummy shook his mobiled head. "It were well to take with you nothing but your horoscope, for this alone shall you retain in the end." Nushain stooped above the table on which he had left his nativity. Before he began to roll the open papyrus, he noticed that the hieroglyph of the mummy had vanished. It was as if the written symbol, after moving athwart his horoscope, had materialized itself in the figure that now attended him. But on the chart's nether margin, in remote opposition to the dog, was the sea-blue hieroglyph of a quaint merman with carp-like tail and head, half human, half apish, and behind the merman was the black hieroglyph of a small barge. Nushain's fear, for a moment, was subdued by wonder, but he rolled the chart carefully and stood holding it in his right hand. "Come," said the guide. "Your time is brief, and you must pass through the 3 elements that guard the dwelling place of Vergama from unseasonable intrusion." These words in a measure confirmed the astrologer's divinations. But the mystery of his future fate was in no wise lightened by the intimation that he must enter, presumably at the journey's end, the dim house of that being called Vergama, whom some considered the most secret of all the gods, and others the most cryptical of demons. In all the lands of Zothique there were rumors and fables regarding Vergama, but these were wholly diverse and contradictory, except in their common attribution of almost omnipotent powers to this entity. No man knew the situation of his abode, but it was believed that vast multitudes of people had entered it during the centuries and millenniums, and that none had returned therefrom. Ofttimes had Nushain called upon the name of Vergama, swearing or protesting thereby as men are wont to do by the cognomens of their shrouded lords. But now, hearing the name from the lips of his macabre visitor, he was filled with the darkest and most eerie apprehensions. He sought to subdue these feelings, and to resign himself to the manifest will of the stars. With Mouzda and Ansarath at his heels, he followed the striding mummy, which seemed little hampered, if at all, by its trailing cerements. With one regretful backward glance at his littered books and papers, he passed from the attic room and down the tenement stairs. A wannish light seemed to cling about the swathings of the mummy, but apart from this there was no illumination, and Nushain thought that the house was strangely dark and silent, as if all its occupants had died or had gone away. He heard no sound from the evening city, nor could he see aught but close encroaching darkness beyond the windows that should have gazed on a little street. Also, it seemed that the stairs had changed and lengthened, giving no more on the courtyard of the tenement, but plunging deviously into an unsuspected region of stifling vaults and foul, dismal nitrous corridors. Here the air was pregnant with death, and the heart of Nushain failed him. Everywhere, in the shadow-curtained crypts and deep-shelved recesses, he felt the innumerable presence of the dead. He thought that there was a sad sighing of stirred cerements, a breath exhaled by long-stiffened cadavers, a dry clicking of lipless teeth beside him as he went. But darkness walled his vision, and he saw nothing save the luminous form of his guide, who stalked onward as if through a natal realm. It seemed to Nushain that he passed through boundless catacombs, in which were housed the mortality and corruption of all the ages. Behind him still he heard the shuffling of Mouzda, and at whiles the low, frightened whine of Ansarath. So he knew that the twain were faithful to him. But upon him, with a chill of lethal damps, there grew the horror of his surroundings, and he shrank with all the repulsion of living flesh from the shrouded thing that he followed, and those other things that mouldered round about in the fathomless gloom. Half thinking to hearten himself by the sound of his own voice, he began to question the guide, though his tongue clove to his mouth as if palsied. "Is it indeed Vergama and none other who has summoned me forth upon this journey? For what purpose has he called me, and in what land is his dwelling?" "Your fate has summoned you," said the mummy. "In the end, at the time appointed and no sooner, you shall learn the purpose. As to your third question, you would be no wiser if I should name the region in which the house of Vergama is hidden from mortal trespass, for the land is not listed on any terrene chart, nor map of the starry heavens." These answers seemed equivocal and disquieting to Nushain, who was possessed by frightful forebodings as he went deeper into the subterranean charnels. Dark indeed, he thought, must be the goal of a journey whose first stage had led him so far amid the empire of death and corruption, and dubious surely was the being who had called him forth and had sent to him as the first guide a sere and shrunken mummy clad in the tomb's habiliments. Now, as he pondered these matters almost to frenzy, the shelfy walls of the catacomb before him were outlined by a dismal light, and he came after the mummy into a chamber where tall candles of black pitch and sockets of tarnished silver burned about an immense and solitary sarcophagus. Upon the blank lid and sides of the sarcophagus, as Nushain neared it, he could see neither runes nor sculptures nor hieroglyphs engraven, but seemed, from the proportions, that a giant must lie within. The mummy passed athwart the chamber without pausing, but Nushain, seeing that the vaults beyond were full of darkness, drew back with a reluctance that he could not conquer, and though the stars had decreed his journey, it seemed to him that human flesh could go no farther. Prompted by a sudden impulse, he seized one of the heavy yard-long tapers that burned stilly about the sarcophagus, and holding it in his left hand, with his horoscope still firmly clutched in the right, he fled with Mouzda and Ansarath on the way he had come, hoping to retrace his footsteps through the gloomy caverns and return to Ummaos by the taper's light. He heard no sound of pursuit from the mummy, but ever as he fled, the pitch candle, flaring wildly, revealed to him the horrors that darkness had curtained from his eyes. He saw the bones of men that were piled in repugnant confusion with those of fell monsters, and the riven sarcophagi from which protruded the half-decayed members of inanimate beings, members which were neither heads nor hands nor feet. And soon the catacomb divided and redivided before him, so that he must choose his way at random, not knowing whether it would lead him back to Ummaos or into the untrod depths. Presently he came to the huge browless skull of an uncouth creature, which reposed on the ground with upward-gazing orbits, and beyond the skull was the monster's mouldy skeleton, wholly blocking the passage. Its ribs were cramped by the narrowing walls, as if it had crept there and had died in the darkness, unable to withdraw or go forward. White spiders, demon-headed and large as monkeys, had woven their webs in the hollow arches of the bones, and they swarmed out interminably as Nushain approached, and the skeleton seemed to stir and quiver as they seethed over it abhorrently and dropped to the ground before the astrologer. Behind them, others poured in a countless army, crowding and mantling every ossicle. Nushain fled with his companions, and running back to the forking of the caverns he followed another passage. Here he was not pursued by the demon spiders, but hurrying on lest they or the mummy overtake him, he was soon halted by the rim of a great pit which filled the catacomb from wall to wall, and was over-wide for the leaping of man. The dog Ansarath, sniffing certain odors that arose from the pit, recoiled with a mad howling, and Nushain, holding the taper outstretched above it, discerned far down a glimmer of ripples spreading circle-wise on some unctuous black fluid, and two blood-red spots appeared to swim with a weaving motion at the center. Then he heard a hissing as of some great cauldron heated by wizard fires, and it seemed that the blackness boiled upward, mounting swiftly and evilly to overflow the pit, and the red spots, as they neared him, were like luminous eyes that gazed malignantly into his own. So Nushain turned away in haste, and returning upon his steps, he found the mummy awaiting him at the junction of the catacombs. "It would seem, O Nushain, that you have doubted your own horoscope," said the guide with a certain irony. "However, even a bad astrologer on occasion may read the heavens aright. Obey then the stars that decreed your journey." Henceforward, Nushain followed the mummy without recalcitrance. Returning to the chamber in which stood the immense sarcophagus, he was enjoined by his guide to replace in its socket the black taper he had stolen. Without other light than the phosphorescence of the mummy's cerements, he threaded the foul gloom of those profounder ossuaries which lay beyond. At last, through caverns where a dull dawning intruded upon the shadows, he came out beneath shrouded heavens, on the shore of a wild sea that clamored in mist and cloud and spindrift, as if recoiling from the harsh air and light, the mummy drew back into the subterrane, and it said, "Here my dominion ends, and I must leave you to await the second guide." Standing with the poignant sea salt in his nostrils, with his hair and garments outblown on the gale, Nushain heard a metallic clangor, and saw that a door of rusty bronze had closed in the cavern entrance. The beach was walled by unscalable cliffs that ran sheerly to the wave on each hand. So perforce the astrologer waited, and from the torn surf he beheld ere long the emergence of a sea-blue merman, whose head was half human, half fish, and behind the merman there hove a small black barge that was not steered or moved by any visible being. At this, Nushain recalled the hieroglyphs of the sea creature, and the boat which had appeared on the margin of his nativity, and unrolling the papyrus, he saw with wonderment that the figures were both gone. And he doubted not that they had passed like the mummy's hieroglyph through all the zodiacal houses, even to that house which presided over his destiny, and thence, mayhap, they had emerged into material being. But in their stead now was the burning hieroglyph of a fire-colored salamander, set opposite to the great dog. The merman beckoned to him with antic gestures, grinning deeply and showing the white serrations of his shark-like teeth. Nushain went forward and entered the barge in obedience to the signs made by the sea creature, and Mouzda and Ansarath, in faithfulness to their master, accompanied him. Thereupon the merman swam away through the boiling surf, and the barge, as if oared and ruddered by mere enchantment, swung about forthwith, and warring smoothly against the wind and wave, was drawn straightly over that dim, unnameable ocean. Half seen amid rushing foam and mist, the merman swam steadily on before. Time and space were surely outpassed during that voyage, and as if he had gone beyond mortal existence, Nushain experienced neither thirst nor hunger, but it seemed that his soul drifted upon seas of strange doubt and direst alienation, and he feared the misty chaos about him, even as he had feared the nighted catacombs. Often he tried to question the mer-creature concerning their destination, but received no answer, and the wind blowing from shores unguessed, and the tide flowing to unknown gulfs, were alike filled with whispers of awe and terror. Nushain pondered the mysteries of his journey almost to madness, and the thought came to him that, after passing through the region of death, he was now traversing the gray limbo of uncreated things, and, thinking this, he was loath to surmise the third stage of his journey, and he dared not reflect upon the nature of its goal. Anon, suddenly, the mists were riven, and a cataract of golden rays poured down from a high-seated sun. Near at hand, to the lee of the driving barge, a tall island hove with verdurous trees and light shell-shaped domes and blossomy gardens hanging far up in the dazzlement of noon. There, with a sleepy purling, the surf was lulled on a low grassy shore that had not known the anger of storm, and fruited vines and full-blown flowers were pendant above the water. It seemed that a spell of oblivion and slumber was shed from the island, and that any who landed thereon would dwell inviolable forever in sun-bright dreams. Nushain was seized with a longing for its green, flowery refuge, and he wished to voyage no farther into the dreadful nothingness of the mist-bound ocean. And between his longing and his terror, he quite forgot the terms of that destiny which had been ordained for him by the stars. There was no halting nor swerving of the barge, but it drew still nearer to the isle in its coasting, and Nushain saw that the intervening water was clear and shallow, so that a tall man might easily wade to the beach. He sprang into the sea, holding his horoscope aloft, and began to walk toward the island. And Mouzda and Ansarath followed him, swimming side by side. Though hampered somewhat by his long, wet robes, the astrologer thought to reach that alluring shore, nor was there any movement on the part of the merman to intercept him. The water was midway between his waist and his armpits, and now it lapped at his girdle, and now at the knee-folds of his garment, and the island vines and blossoms drooped fragrantly above him. Then, being but a step from that enchanted beach, he heard a great hissing, and saw that the vines, the boughs, the flowers, the very grasses, were intertwined and mingled with a million serpents, writhing endlessly to and fro in hideous agitation. From all parts of that lofty island the hissing came, and the serpents, with foully mottled volumes, coiled, crept, and slithered upon it everywhere, and no single yard of its surface was free from their defilement, or clear for human treading. Turning seaward in his revulsion, Nushain found the merman and the barge waiting close at hand. Hopelessly he re-entered the barge with his followers, and the magically driven boat resumed its course. And now, for the first time, the merman spoke, saying over his shoulder in a harsh, half-articulate voice, not without irony, "It would seem, O Nushain, that you lack faith in your own divinations. However, even the poorest of astrologers may sometimes cast a horoscope correctly. Cease then to rebel against that which the stars have written." The barge drove on, and the mists closed heavily about it, and the noon-bright island was lost to view. After a vague interim, the muffled sun went down behind inchoate waters and clouds, and a darkness as of primal night lay everywhere. Presently, through the torn wrack, Nushain beheld a strange heaven, whose signs and planets he could not recognize. And at this there came upon him the black horror of utmost dereliction. Then the mists and clouds returned, veiling that unknown sky from his scrutiny, and he could discern nothing but the merman, who was visible by a wan phosphor that clung always about him in his swimming. Still the barge drove on, and in time it seemed that a red morning rose stifled and conflagrant behind the mists. The boat entered the broadening light, and Nushain, who had thought to behold the sun once more, was dazzled by a strange shore where flames towered in a high unbroken wall, feeding perpetually, to all appearances, on bare sand and rock. With a mighty leaping and a roar as of blown surf, the flames went up, and a heat like that of many furnaces smote far on the sea. Swiftly the barge neared the shore, and the merman, with uncouth gestures of farewell, dived and disappeared under the waters. Nushain could scarcely regard the flames or endure their heat, but the barge touched the straight tongue of land lying between them and the sea, and before Nushain, from the wall of fire, a blazing salamander emerged, having the form and hue of that hieroglyph which had last appeared on his horoscope, and he knew, with ineffable consternation, that this was the third guide of his threefold journey. "Come with me," said the salamander, in a voice like the crackling of burning branches. Nushain stepped from the barge to that strand which was hot as an oven beneath his feet, and behind him, though with palpable reluctance, Mouzda and Ansarath still followed. But, approaching the flames behind the salamander, and half swooning from their ardor, he was overcome by the weakness of mortal flesh, and seeking again to evade his destiny, he fled along the narrow scroll of beach between the fire and the water. But he had gone only a few paces when the salamander, with a great fiery roaring and racing, intercepted him, and it drove him straight toward the fire with terrible flailings of its dragon-like tail, from which showers of sparks were emitted. He could not face the salamander, and he thought the flames would consume him like paper as he entered them. But in the wall there appeared a sort of opening, and the fires arched themselves into an arcade, and he passed through with his followers, herded by the salamander, into an ashen land where all things were veiled with low-hanging smoke and steam. Here the salamander observed with a kind of irony, "Not wrongly, O Nushain, have you interpreted the stars of your horoscope. And now your journey draws to an end, and you will need no longer the services of a guide." So saying, it left him, going out like a quenched fire on the smoky air. Nushain, standing irresolute, beheld before him a white stairway that mounted amid the veering vapors. Behind him the flames rose unbroken, like a topless rampart, and on either hand, from instant to instant, the smoke shaped itself into demon forms and faces that menaced him. He began to climb the stairs, and the shapes gathered below and about, frightful as a wizard's familiars, and keeping pace with him as he went upward, so that he dared not pause or retreat. Far up he climbed in the fumy dimness, and came unaware to the open portals of a house of grey stone, rearing to unguessed height and amplitude. Unwillingly but driven by the thronging of the smoky shapes, he passed through the portals with his companions. The house was a place of long, empty halls, tortuous as the folds of a sea conch. There were no windows, no lamps, but it seemed that bright suns of silver had been dissolved and diffused in the air. Fleeing from the hellish wraiths that pursued him, the astrologer followed the winding halls, and emerged ultimately in an inner chamber where space itself was immured. At the room's center, a cowled and muffled figure of colossal proportions sat upright on a marble chair, silent, unstirring. Before the figure, on a sort of table, a vast volume lay open. Nushain felt the awe of one who approaches the presence of some high demon or deity. Seeing that the phantoms had vanished, he paused on the room's threshold, for its immensity made him giddy like the void interval that lies between the worlds. He wished to withdraw, but a voice issued from the cowled being, speaking softly as the voice of his own inmost mind. "I am Vergama, whose other name is Destiny. Vergama, on whom you have called so ignorantly and idly, as men are wont to call on their hidden lords. Vergama, who has summoned you on the journey which all men must make at one time or another, in one way or another. Come forward, O Nushain, and read a little in my book." The astrologer was drawn as by an unseen hand to the table. Leaning above it, he saw that the huge volume stood open at its middle pages, which were covered with a myriad signs written in inks of various colors, and representing men, gods, fishes, birds, monsters, animals, constellations, and many other things. At the end of the last column of the right-hand page, where little space was left for other inscriptions, Nushain beheld the hieroglyphs of an equal-sided triangle of stars, such as had lately appeared in proximity to the dog, and, following these, the hieroglyphs of a mummy, a merman, a barge, and a salamander, resembling the figures that had come and gone on his horoscope, and those that had guided him to the house of Vergama. "In my book," said the cowled figure, "the characters of all things are written and preserved. All visible forms in the beginning were but symbols written by me, and at the last they shall exist only as the writing of my book. For a season they issue forth, taking to themselves that which is known as substance. It was I, O Nushain, who set in the heavens the stars that foretold your journey. I who sent the 3 guides, and these things, having served their purpose, are now but in foliate ciphers as before." Vergama paused, and an infinite silence returned to the room, and a measureless wonder was upon the mind of Nushain. And the cowled being continued. "Among men, for a while, there was that person called Nushain, the astrologer, together with the dog Ansarath, and the black Mouzda, who followed his fortunes. But now very shortly, I must turn the page, and before turning it, must finish the writing that belongs thereon." Nushain thought that a wind arose in the chamber, moving lightly with a weird sigh, though he felt not the actual breath of its passing. But he saw that the fur of Ansarath, cowering close beside him, was ruffled by the wind. Then, beneath his marveling eyes, the dog began to dwindle and wither, as if seared by a lethal magic, and he lessened to the size of a rat, and thence to the smallness of a mouse, and the lightness of an insect, though preserving still his original form. After that, the tiny thing was caught up by the sighing air, and it flew past Nushain as a gnat might fly, and following it, he saw that the hieroglyph of a dog was inscribed suddenly beside that of the salamander, at the bottom of the right-hand page. But apart from this, there remained no trace of Ansarath. Again a wind breathed in the room, touching not the astrologer, but fluttering the ragged raiment of Mouzda, who crouched near to his master, as if appealing for protection, and the mute became shrunken and shriveled, turning at the last to a thing light and thin as the black, tattered wing shard of a beetle, which the air bore aloft. And Nushain saw that the hieroglyph of a one-eyed black man was inscribed following that of the dog. But, aside from this, there was no sign of Mouzda. Now, perceiving clearly the doom that was designed for him, Nushain would have fled from the presence of Vergama. He turned from the outspread volume, and ran toward the chamber door, his worn, tawdry robes of an astrologer flapping about his thin shanks, but softly in his ear as he went there sounded the voice of Vergama. Vainly do men seek to resist or evade that destiny which turns them to ciphers in the end. In my book, O Nushain, there is room even for a bad astrologer. Once more the weird sighing arose, and a cold air played upon Nushain as he ran, and he paused midway in the vast room as if a wall had arrested him. Gently the air breathed on his lean, gaunt figure, and it lifted his graying locks and beard, and it plucked softly at the roll of papyrus, which he still held in his hand. To his dim eyes, the room seemed to reel and swell, expanding infinitely. Borne upward, around and around, in a swift vertiginous swirling, he beheld the seated shape as it loomed ever higher above him in cosmic vastness. Then the god was lost in light, and Nushain was a weightless and exiled thing, the withered skeleton of a lost leaf, rising and falling on the bright whirlwind. In the book of Vergama, at the end of the last column of the right-hand page, there stood the hieroglyph of a gaunt astrologer, carrying a furled nativity. Vergama leaned forward from his chair and turned the page. Thank you for listening. If you like our recordings, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss any more audiobooks.